What would you do if your new neighbor suddenly declared that part of your backyard was theirs, and they were ready to fight for it? Welcome to Willow Creek, a serene suburban neighborhood where families thrive, friendships blossom, and disputes over property lines are the last thing you'd expect. My name is Mark Anderson, and for over a decade, my wife Sophia and I have lived on Maple Lane with our kids. Our backyard is our sanctuary, a cozy space with a barbecue grill, a small vegetable garden, and a patch of grass where our kids love to play. Life here was peaceful, until Joanne moved in next door. Joanne arrived at the house next to ours, a charming home at number 42, with all the hallmarks of a perfect neighbor. She introduced herself with a warm smile, dropped off a basket of homemade cookies, and waved enthusiastically every time we crossed paths. At first, Sophia and I were thrilled. A friendly neighbor? This was going to be great. Little did we know, Joanne was about to turn our peaceful street into a battleground. It all began one crisp Saturday morning. I was in the backyard, raking leaves near the fence that separated our property from hers. That's when Joanne appeared, hands on her hips and a determined look on her face. "Excuse me, Mark," she called out. "I need you to step off my property." Her property? I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her right. "I'm sorry, Joanne," I said with a chuckle. "This is my yard. We've lived here for over 10 years, and this fence marks the property line." Joanne didn't flinch. "That's incorrect," she said firmly. "My realtor informed me that my property extends 10 feet past this fence. So that patch of grass you're standing on? It belongs to me now." I stared at her, incredulous. "Joanne," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "this fence has been here since before we moved in. It's the official boundary, and I have the paperwork to prove it." But Joanne wasn't backing down. "Realtors don't make mistakes," she snapped. "If you don't move, I'll have no choice but to take further action." At that moment, Sophia stepped outside, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between Joanne and me. Before I could explain, Joanne made a declaration that sent chills down my spine. "If you won't cooperate, I'll call the police." "You can't be serious," I said, staring at Joanne. My rake was still in hand, frozen mid-motion. The idea that a neighbor, someone I barely knew, could just march over and claim part of our backyard seemed surreal. Yet here she was, unwavering and dead serious. Joanne stood her ground on the edge of the lawn, her finger pointed accusatorily at the grass beneath my feet. "This land," she said, her voice sharp and decisive, "is part of my property. My realtor made it very clear. The boundary extends 10 feet past that old fence." I glanced at the fence she mentioned, a weathered wooden divider that had stood between the properties for years. It wasn't pristine, but it had clearly marked the boundary since before we moved in over a decade ago. "Joanne," I started, forcing a calmness I didn't quite feel, "this fence has always been the property line. It's backed by our deed. I can even show you the documents." Her expression hardened. "You think waving a piece of paper will change what I know? You've been using this land as if it's yours, but it's not. It's mine, and I won't let you take advantage of me." At this point, Sophia had joined me in the yard, sensing the escalating tension. "What's happening here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Joanne and me. I quickly explained Joanne's claim, half expecting Sophia to laugh at the absurdity of it. Instead, she frowned, sensing the storm brewing. "Joanne," Sophia said diplomatically, "this sounds like a misunderstanding. Why don't we sit down and look at the property documents together? That way, we can clear this up without any confusion." But Joanne wasn't interested in diplomacy. "Oh, I'm not confused," she snapped, her voice rising. "I've already spoken to my realtor, and I know exactly where my property ends. What you're doing is trespassing." I could feel my patience thinning. "Trespassing?" I repeated, incredulous. We've lived here for over 10 years. This fence was here long before either of us moved in. If you're so confident, why not double-check with a surveyor before making these accusations?" Her face flushed a deep red. "Why should I pay for a survey when I already know I'm right? If you refuse to move off my land, I'll have to escalate this." Sophia stepped closer to me, her voice calm but firm. "Joanne, let's not turn this into something bigger than it needs to be. We're your neighbors. Surely, we can work this out without threats." But Joanne wasn't having it. She let out a frustrated huff, stamping her foot like a child denied a toy. "This is my property, and you have no right to it. If you don't move, I'll call the police." Sophia and I exchanged a glance, both of us stunned by the sheer audacity of her claim. "Joanne," I said finally, my tone steady but laced with disbelief, "do what you feel you need to. But just know, we're not giving up what's rightfully ours." She turned on her heel, muttering under her breath as she stomped back to her house. I let out a long breath, the weight of her accusation settling heavily on my shoulders. Sophia reached for my hand. "What just happened?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I have a bad feeling this isn't the end of it." And I was right. Joanne's declaration of ownership was just the opening salvo in what would become one of the most bizarre and infuriating battles we'd ever faced. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the tranquility of Willow Creek was shattered by flashing red and blue lights pulling up to our driveway. Joanne had called the police. Sophia and I were in the kitchen, sipping coffee, when the sound of sirens made us freeze. We exchanged a quick, confused glance before rushing to the front door. By the time we stepped outside, 2 uniformed officers were already speaking with Joanne, who was gesticulating wildly in the direction of our backyard. "She's really doing this," Sophia muttered under her breath, disbelief etched across her face. I nodded grimly. Joanne had threatened to escalate things, but I didn't think she'd actually go this far. Joanne's voice carried across the yard, shrill and indignant. "They're trespassing on my property, and they refuse to leave. I've asked them nicely, but they just won't listen. I need you to do something about it." The taller of the 2 officers raised a hand, attempting to calm her. "Ma'am, we'll get to the bottom of this. Please lower your voice and remain calm." Joanne wasn't having it. "Calm? How can I be calm when they're stealing my land?" I approached the officers cautiously, hands slightly raised to show I meant no harm. "Officers, good morning," I started, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath the surface. "There seems to be a misunderstanding here." Joanne immediately interrupted. "There's no misunderstanding. That patch of grass is mine, and he refuses to stay off it." The officers turned to me, clearly looking for a more rational explanation. "Sir," one of them said, "can you tell us your side of the story?" I took a deep breath and explained everything, how my family had lived here for over a decade, how the fence had always been the established boundary, and how Joanne had suddenly decided the property line extended into our yard. I also offered to provide documentation to prove our claim. "Do you have those documents on hand?" the officer asked. "I can get them from inside," I replied, but before I could take a step toward the house, Joanne let out a sharp, panicked cry. "Don't let him go. He might be getting a weapon." The officer sighed heavily, clearly growing tired of the theatrics. "Ma'am, please," he said firmly. "There's no reason to assume anyone here is armed. Sir, go ahead and retrieve your documents." I shot Joanne a disbelieving look before heading inside. Sophia followed me, her expression a mixture of anger and concern. "This woman is unbelievable," she whispered. "Calling the police over this? What's next?" When I returned with the paperwork, the officers reviewed it carefully. Joanne stood to the side, arms crossed, her face a deep shade of red. "Those papers could be forged," she snapped, her voice shaking with anger. I demand that you arrest them." The officer who seemed to be in charge handed the documents back to me and turned to Joanne. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firm, "this property clearly belongs to the Andersons. There's no evidence of trespassing here. I suggest you consult with a surveyor if you still have doubts, but as of now, there's nothing we can do for you." Joanne's jaw dropped, and for a moment, she was rendered speechless. Then, in a voice tinged with desperation, she wailed, "But it's not fair. That's my yard." The officer wasn't moved. "Ma'am, if you continue to make unfounded accusations or disrupt your neighbors, we may need to take further action. Do you understand?" Tears streaming down her face, Joanne nodded reluctantly before stomping back to her house and slamming the door behind her. The officers turned to me, apologizing for the disturbance before heading back to their cruiser. As the lights of the police car disappeared down Maple Lane, Sophia and I stood in stunned silence. "What just happened?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "I have no idea, but something tells me this isn't over." And I was right. Joanne's failed attempt to use the police was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, her antics escalated in ways we could never have imagined. What started as a property dispute was quickly spiraling into something far more personal, and far more dangerous. It started as a perfect Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining, the grill was sizzling, and the scent of burgers wafted through the air. We had invited a few friends over for a backyard barbecue, eager to enjoy some much-needed relaxation after the chaos Joanne had already caused. But little did we know, Joanne wasn't finished. She was just getting started. I was flipping burgers on the grill, laughing at a joke one of my friends had made, when the unmistakable roar of a chainsaw broke through the air. The sound was jarring, unnatural in our quiet neighborhood. I froze, spatula in hand, my stomach twisting into a knot. Slowly, I turned toward the noise, and there she was. Joanne stood at the edge of our yard, wild-eyed and determined, gripping a roaring chainsaw like some deranged lumberjack. Her gaze was fixed on the old wooden fence that divided our properties, and before I could process what was happening, she took her first swing. "Joanne!" I yelled, dropping the spatula and running toward her. Splinters flew through the air as the chainsaw tore into the weathered boards. Our guests gasped, some instinctively backing away, others frozen in shock. Sophia appeared at the patio door, her face pale. "Mark, what's going on?" "She's cutting down the fence," I shouted back. "Get everyone inside. Now." Joanne didn't even glance at me as she continued hacking away at the fence, her movements erratic but purposeful. "This fence is on my property," she screamed over the deafening noise. "I'm taking it back." I stopped a few feet away, my heart pounding in my chest. "Joanne, put the chainsaw down. You're destroying our property." She finally turned to face me, her eyes blazing. "It's not your property, Mark. It's mine. And if you won't move it, I will." The tension was unbearable. I knew I couldn't approach her with that chainsaw in her hands, but I also couldn't stand by and let her tear down our fence. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaky as I explained the situation. "She's armed with a chainsaw and destroying our fence," I told the dispatcher. "Please, send someone quickly." By the time the police arrived, Joanne had already managed to demolish a significant portion of the fence. The officers approached cautiously, their hands near their holsters. "Ma'am," one of them called out, "put down the chainsaw and step away from the fence." Joanne turned toward them, her grip tightening on the handle. "This is my property," she yelled, her voice breaking. "They've been stealing from me, and I'm taking it back." The lead officer's voice grew sharper. "Ma'am, drop the chainsaw now, or we will take action." For a moment, I thought she might actually turn the chainsaw on them. But then, as the officers advanced, she hesitated. Finally, with a loud sigh, she powered down the chainsaw and let it drop to the ground. The officers quickly moved in, handcuffing her as she continued to rant about her property rights. "This isn't over," she screamed as they led her toward the patrol car. "You're all thieves. Every one of you." As the officers drove away with Joanne in custody, I stood in the wreckage of the fence, my hands trembling. The fence could be repaired, sure, but something about her determination, her willingness to go this far, chilled me to my core. Sophia came up beside me, her hand slipping into mine. "What now?" she asked softly. I shook my head, still staring at the broken boards. "I don't know," I admitted. "But something tells me this isn't the last we've seen of Joanne." I was right. Joanne's arrest was just another chapter in her relentless crusade. What followed would push us to the brink, and test every ounce of patience we had left. If I thought Joanne's arrest would mark the end of our ordeal, I couldn't have been more wrong. Just days after the chainsaw incident, we received a knock on our door, a process server delivering a lawsuit. Joanne was suing us. The claim? Adverse possession. According to Joanne, her continuous and open use of the disputed strip of land gave her legal rights to it. It didn't matter that her claim was absurd, we were now facing the financial and emotional strain of a full-blown legal battle. Sophia sat at the kitchen table that evening, holding the lawsuit in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with frustration and exhaustion. "Mark, how much more of this can we take?" she asked quietly. "She's turning our lives upside down." "Over grass." I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though my own nerves were fraying. "We're not going to let her bully us," I said firmly. "She's wrong, and we'll prove it. But, yeah, it's going to be a fight." And what a fight it was. The weeks that followed were some of the most grueling of our lives. Joanne, with the help of a cheap, sleazy lawyer, filed motion after motion, dragging out the process and forcing us to attend hearing after hearing. Every court appearance came with mounting legal fees, and the time away from work began to weigh on us. Sophia's breaking point came during dinner one evening. As I helped the kids with homework, she slammed her laptop shut and buried her face in her hands. "I can't do this anymore, Mark," she said, her voice cracking. "The stress, the money, it's too much. I just want our life back." Seeing her so broken made my chest ache. Sophia had always been the steady one, the glue holding everything together. But Joanne's relentless campaign was tearing at the seams of our family. I knelt beside her and wrapped my arms around her. "We'll get through this," I whispered. "I promise." When our court date finally arrived, Joanne entered the courtroom with the kind of smug confidence that only comes from delusion. She strutted past us without a glance, her lawyer clutching a folder of what I assumed was their evidence. Her argument was as weak as we had anticipated. Joanne's lawyer spun a tale of how she had been led to believe the land was hers, how she had made improvements by removing the fence, and how we were the real trespassers. I could barely suppress my anger as she played the victim, her voice trembling with faux emotion. "All I ever wanted was what's rightfully mine," she told the judge, tears brimming in her eyes. Then it was our turn. Our lawyer presented everything, our deed, the property survey, tax records, and, our trump card, video evidence of Joanne trespassing and destroying the fence. As the footage played, the courtroom fell silent. Joanne's face grew redder with every passing second, her lawyer shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The judge didn't deliberate long. "This court finds in favor of the Andersons," he declared, his tone firm. Joanne's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, and she was ordered to pay all our legal fees. But he wasn't finished. "Ms. Joanne, your behavior in this matter has been nothing short of reprehensible," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I am referring this case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges. Furthermore, I am extending the restraining order to ensure you remain no less than 100 feet from the Andersons or their property." When the ruling came down, Sophia clutched my hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of joy. They were tears of exhaustion, of relief mingled with the lingering pain of everything we had endured. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice carried more weariness than triumph. I nodded, but deep down, I couldn't shake the ache in my chest. Joanne's actions had cost us more than money or time. She had stolen our peace, our sense of safety in our own home. As we walked out of the courthouse, I glanced back at Joanne. She sat slumped in her chair, her lawyer hurriedly packing up their things. For the first time, she didn't look like the enemy. She looked lost. Sophia squeezed my hand. "Let's go," she said softly. And we did, leaving Joanne and her crusade behind us. Or so we thought. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. The legal battle was over, the fence would soon be repaired, and Joanne was under a strict restraining order. But the damage she had done, to our family, our peace, and our trust in our community, lingered like a bruise that refused to heal. The silence broke one morning with the rumble of a moving truck. From our kitchen window, I could see Joanne standing in her driveway, directing movers as they carried boxes out of her house. She looked smaller somehow, her posture hunched, her fiery defiance extinguished. Sophia joined me at the window, her expression unreadable. "She's leaving," I said quietly. Sophia's voice was measured, but her emotions rippled beneath the surface. "Good. Maybe now we can start to heal." Later that day, there was a knock at our door. I opened it to find Joanne standing there, holding an envelope. Her eyes, once blazing with righteous anger, now looked tired and red-rimmed. "I'm moving," she said simply, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I've caused enough trouble here. The neighbors hate me. I can't stay." I didn't know what to say. Joanne held out the envelope. "This is for you. To cover the fence repairs, and everything else." I took the envelope cautiously, unsure of her intentions. "Joanne." She cut me off, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. For all of it. I wasn't in a good place. I see that now." She swallowed hard, her hands shaking. "I'm going to live with my sister in Florida. I'm getting help. I just wanted you to know." As she turned and walked back to her house, I opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000. Far more than the cost of the damages. I stared at it, dumbfounded. Sophia appeared beside me. "What is it?" she asked. "She gave us this," I said, handing her the envelope. "And she apologized." Sophia looked at the check, then out the window toward Joanne's house. I didn't think she had it in her. Weeks passed, and life at Willow Creek began to return to normal. The new fence was installed, sturdier than the old one, and for the first time in months, the kids played in the backyard without fear of being watched. The weight of Joanne's presence began to lift. But then, another letter arrived. This one wasn't a lawsuit or a threat. It was from Joanne. Her handwriting was uneven, her words raw and vulnerable. "Dear Mark and Sophia, I've started therapy. My sister convinced me it was time. I didn't realize how much my past had affected me until I saw myself through your eyes. I was angry, hurt, and scared, and I took it out on you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change. Thank you for standing up to me. It forced me to face my own demons." Sophia read the letter aloud, her voice breaking slightly. When she finished, we sat in silence, the weight of Joanne's words settling over us. "Do you believe her?" I asked finally. Sophia nodded slowly. "I do. And I hope she finds peace. But I'm glad she's gone. Months later, as we sat around the fire pit in our backyard, roasting marshmallows with the kids, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Joanne had pushed us to our limits, but in doing so, she had shown us the strength of our family and the resilience of our community. Do you think she's okay now? Sophia asked softly, staring into the flames. I thought about Joanne, her desperation, her apologies, and the letter that hinted at a new beginning. I hope so, I said. Everyone deserves a chance to heal. The fence stood tall around our yard, a reminder of the battle we had fought and won. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in reclaiming our peace, our home, and, in some small way, our compassion for someone who had lost her way. As the fire crackled and the kids laughed, I realized that while Joanne had left, she had also taught us an important lesson. Sometimes, even in the midst of chaos and conflict, there is room for understanding and growth. And in that, we had truly found closure. Life on Maple Lane has finally returned to normal. The fence is strong, the laughter of children echoes in the backyard again, and our evenings are filled with the kind of quiet peace we once took for granted. But while the storm Joanne brought into our lives has passed, its lessons remain. Looking back, it's hard to fathom how a simple dispute over a strip of grass spiraled into a months-long ordeal of police calls, lawsuits, and chainsaws. Joanne tested our patience, our resolve, and even our compassion. But in the end, we stood our ground, not just for our property, but for our family's sense of security and the values we hold dear. And somehow, amidst the chaos, we found growth. We learned the importance of boundaries, both literal and emotional. The strength to say, "This is ours, and you cannot take it." The wisdom to document every interaction, every detail, so the truth would prevail. But perhaps most surprisingly, we learned that even in the face of someone's worst behavior, there is room for understanding. Joanne's eventual apology and her efforts to change showed us that people, no matter how difficult, can find redemption if they're willing to confront their own demons. As I sit here now, sipping coffee with Sophia on our new patio, I can't help but feel grateful. Grateful for our resilient family, for the neighbors who rallied behind us, and for the lessons we never expected to learn. Life on Maple Lane isn't perfect, no place is, but it's ours. Every square inch of it. So, what would you do if a neighbor tried to claim your yard? Would you fight tooth and nail, or would you let it go to preserve your peace? And let's be honest, how far would you go if it were you dealing with someone like Joanne? If you've ever had a neighbor from hell or found yourself at odds with HOA rules, we want to hear about it. Did you stand your ground, or did you find another way to resolve the conflict? Share your stories in the comments below, we're all ears. Let's swap tales of property disputes, wild Karens, and impossible HOAs. After all, sometimes the best way to heal from the absurdity of it all is to laugh, commiserate, and find solidarity with others who've been there too. Who knows? Your story might even help someone else facing their own battle on their slice of the lawn.